On the frigid morning of January 17, 1781, in a frost-hardened cow pasture in the South Carolina backcountry, a 44-year-old American general with sciatica so severe he could barely sit a horse arranged his men in 3 lines facing the most feared cavalry commander in the British Army. Less than an hour later, 800 of Banastre Tarleton's 1,100 soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The British Legion, the elite striking force of Lord Cornwallis's Southern Army, had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Think about those numbers. Less than 60 minutes. 800 casualties from a force of 1,100. A 70% annihilation rate inflicted by militiamen who, by every conventional measure, should have broken and run at the first sight of British bayonets. Contemporary accounts on both sides confirm these figures. This wasn't propaganda. This was documented, impossible collapse. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a wagon driver who once survived 500 lashes designed the only piece of original tactical thought to emerge from the entire American Revolution. Battles were not chaos, they were decisions. And on this January morning, every decision had already been made before the first shot was fired. The British didn't lose at Cowpens. They were lured into losing, step by step, volley by volley, into a trap so precisely engineered that contemporary witnesses described it as having the quality of a stage performance. An architecture of deception that left an entire elite British force annihilated in less time than it takes to ride a horse to the next town. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that rewrote the rules of warfare in the New World. First, the deliberate decision to put a flooded river at the Army's back, eliminating the option of retreat, a choice every military manual of the era would have called suicidal. Second, the misunderstood order in the middle of the battle that accidentally produced the most devastating maneuver of the engagement, a mistake that became a masterstroke. Third, the 3-second moment when a Continental officer named John Eager Howard looked at his retreating line, recognized something his commander had missed, and gave the command that broke an empire's southern offensive. But here's what makes Cowpens historically extraordinary. How did militia, men who had run at Camden 5 months earlier, leaving an entire American army to be destroyed, stand and deliver volleys at point-blank range against the same enemy that had butchered their countrymen? Why did Banastre Tarleton, an officer whose career was built on aggressive reconnaissance, charge into a battlefield he had not properly scouted? How did a wagon driver from the Virginia frontier understand the psychology of his own men so completely that he could predict, almost to the minute, when each line would fire, when each line would break, and when each line would return to finish the killing? And why does this battle, less than 60 minutes of combat in a forgotten pasture, appear in every modern military academy as the textbook example of the double envelopment in American history? These battles were not about courage. They were about psychology. Hit that subscribe button. Let us step into Hannah's Cowpens to understand how a wagon driver destroyed an empire's elite legion. We need to step back to late 1778, when the British High Command looked at a map of North America and made a calculation that would set the entire chain of events in motion. The war in the North had become a stalemate. After Saratoga in 1777, after France entered the war on the American side, after 3 years of bleeding men and treasure into New England and the mid-Atlantic, British strategists asked a question they should have asked 4 years earlier. What were they actually fighting for? The northern colonies produced goods that competed with British industry. Textiles, iron, manufactured goods, things the home country didn't need. But the South. The South was different. The South produced rice, indigo, tobacco, cash crops that could not be grown in the British Isles, commodities that fed directly into the mercantilist economy that made the empire wealthy. The economic logic was unanswerable. The political logic seemed even stronger. British intelligence, much of it derived from loyalist exiles in London, painted the southern colonies as a population overwhelmingly devoted to the crown, held in submission by a small patriot minority. Send a professional army, establish a base, rally the king's friends, watch the rebellion collapse from within. For a moment, the strategy seemed to work. Savannah fell in 1779. Charleston fell in May 1780, where Major General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered the largest American force of the entire war. Over 5,000 men, an entire army gone in a single capitulation. Then Camden in August 1780, where General Horatio Gates fled the field on his fastest horse, leaving his army to be butchered by Cornwallis's regulars. The Continental presence in the South had been functionally destroyed. But occupation is not pacification. The cities belonged to the British. The backcountry belonged to no one. And in that backcountry, something the British had not anticipated was happening. The war in the interior of South Carolina was not a conflict between two professional armies. It was a civil war. Neighbor against neighbor. Plantation against plantation. Brutal partisan raids met with brutal reprisals. And the officers the British sent to pacify this country, men like Banastre Tarleton, relied on intimidation, on burned farms, on the threat of summary execution. The result was not submission. The result was radicalization. Every neutral settler who watched a British dragoon torch a barn became a patriot. Every militia veteran who heard the cry of Tarleton's quarter sharpened his rifle. Into this collapsing situation walked Major General Nathaniel Greene, who assumed command of the Southern Department in early December 1780. Greene was 38 years old, a former Quaker, a Rhode Islander, and arguably the finest strategic mind in the American Army. He arrived in Charlotte to find an army that was, in his own words, but the shadow of an army. Depleted, malnourished, poorly equipped, outnumbered by Cornwallis's professional force. And Greene did something that every military textbook of the era called impossible. He divided his army. Conventional doctrine held that a smaller force, faced with a larger one, should concentrate. Mass against mass. Greene did the opposite. He split his force, sending Brigadier General Daniel Morgan west of the Catawba River with roughly 600 Continentals and orders to forage, to protect civilians, to threaten British outposts like the major supply depot at 96. The move was not desperation. It was calculation. By dividing his army, Greene created a problem with no solution. If Cornwallis pursued Greene, Morgan would strike the British rear or sweep down toward Charleston. If Cornwallis pursued Morgan, Greene could march on Camden. Two threats. One British army. Whichever way Cornwallis turned, his back was exposed. Cornwallis chose to split his force in turn. To Morgan, he dispatched the man he trusted to move fast and hit hard, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, with orders that were brief, brutal, and absolute. Find Morgan. Destroy him. What Cornwallis did not yet understand was that he had matched his most aggressive officer against the one American commander in the South who had been preparing his entire life for exactly this encounter. Picture a man of 44, broad-shouldered, 6 feet tall, with a face weathered by 20 years of frontier life and a back so destroyed by chronic sciatica that mounting a horse required help from his aides. This was Brigadier General Daniel Morgan in January 1781. The body of a veteran, the mind of a tactician most of his contemporaries would underestimate until the moment he killed them. His origin was not aristocratic. Morgan had been born to Welsh immigrants in New Jersey around 1736, though even he was not entirely certain of his birth year. He ran away from home at 17 after a quarrel with his father, drifted south through Pennsylvania, and eventually settled in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where he became a teamster. A wagon driver, the lowest rank of military auxiliary, hauling supplies for the British Army during the French and Indian War. It was in this capacity that the event occurred, which would define Morgan's relationship with British military authority for the rest of his life. In 1756, for an act of perceived impertinence toward a British officer, Morgan struck the man. The sentence was 500 lashes, a punishment that was, in practical terms, a death sentence. Men did not survive 500 lashes. The flesh of the back came away in strips. The bone was exposed. Infection or shock typically killed the victim before the count was completed. Morgan survived, and for the rest of his life, he carried not only the scars on his back, but a story he loved to tell. The drummer who administered the lashes had miscounted. He had only delivered 499. The British, Morgan would say with a grin, still owed him one lash. That joke contained the entire philosophy of the man. He was tough enough to survive what should have killed him. He was clever enough to recognize a mistake when he saw one, and he was patient enough to wait for the debt to be paid. His military reputation was built at Saratoga in 1777, where his regiment of riflemen, frontiersmen carrying Pennsylvania long rifles instead of muskets, became the most feared unit on the battlefield. At ranges of 200 yards or more, far beyond the effective range of British muskets, Morgan's riflemen picked off officers, sergeants, artillery crews. When General John Burgoyne surrendered an entire British army at Saratoga, Morgan's marksmen were a significant reason why. By 1781, however, the man who walked into Hannah's Cowpens was physically spent. His sciatica was so severe that long marches were torture. He had resigned from the army once already in 1779, frustrated by being passed over for promotion. He had only returned to active service in late 1780, when Washington personally requested it. He commanded what was officially called the Flying Army. In practice, it was a few hundred Continentals, a regiment of Virginia state troops, and whatever militia could be gathered from the surrounding counties. What Morgan understood, what almost no other Continental officer of his era understood, was the psychology of the American militia. Militia were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, hunters, men who had families and farms and businesses to return to. They would fight, often bravely, but only on terms they could accept. Tell a militiaman to stand in a line and trade volleys with British regulars until one side broke, and he would calculate the odds, calculate the cost, and run. Tell a militiaman to fire 2 specific shots at a specific target and then withdraw with honor intact, and he would do exactly what was asked. Morgan did not despise the militia for this. He understood them. He had been one of them. And in the days leading up to Cowpens, he began constructing a battle plan that would not ask the militia to do anything they were incapable of doing. He would ask them to do exactly what they could do, twice, and then he would let them go. The genius was not in trusting the militia. The genius was in understanding them. The British saw the same farmers and assumed they would break. Morgan saw the same farmers and built an entire battle plan around the certainty that they would break, but only after they had done exactly what he needed them to do. There is a difference between an army that breaks because it has failed and an army that breaks because it has succeeded. The British had never grasped that difference. 26 years old, slight of build, dark-haired, intensely ambitious, and possessed of the kind of arrogance that comes from never having lost. This was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton in January 1781. He was not aristocratic in the strict sense. His father, John Tarleton, had been a wealthy Liverpool merchant who served as mayor of the city, with interests in the West Indian sugar trade and shipping. Young Banastre was sent to University College, Oxford, and to the Middle Temple in London to prepare for a legal career. But when his father died in 1773, leaving him an inheritance of approximately £5,000, the 19-year-old proceeded to squander most of it in gambling and dissipation in London. With what remained, in April 1775, he purchased a cornet's commission in the 1st Dragoon Guards. Later that year, he sailed to America as a volunteer with the expedition under General Charles Cornwallis. By 1780, at the age of 25, he commanded the British Legion, a composite unit of light dragoons and infantry dressed in green coats, composed primarily of American loyalists recruited in the Middle Colonies. The Legion was Tarleton's instrument. He had shaped it in his own image. Fast, aggressive, pitiless. They moved through the Carolina backcountry with the speed of a thunderstorm, and their tactical doctrine consisted of a single concept: charge. Charge into the enemy before the enemy could form properly. Charge with sabers drawn. Charge with the psychological weight of green-coated horsemen who had a reputation for asking no questions and taking no prisoners. That reputation had been forged at the Waxhaws in May 1780, where Tarleton's Legion caught a force of Continental infantry under Colonel Abraham Buford. According to American accounts, after Buford's men had attempted to surrender, after they had grounded their muskets, Tarleton's dragoons rode through the formation, cutting down men who were already attempting to lay down arms. The British accounts dispute this. Tarleton himself claimed his horse had been shot from under him, and his men, believing him killed, had attacked in revenge. But the American narrative became the dominant one. Tarleton's quarter became a patriot rallying cry. It meant no quarter at all. It meant a man who would kill the surrendering. And every militiaman in the Carolinas who heard those words sharpened his hatred with them. What Tarleton's superiors had begun to notice, even as his record of victories accumulated, was a concerning pattern. He moved fast. He hit hard. But he did not scout. He did not reconnoiter. He relied on momentum to compensate for information. Lord Cornwallis, who admired Tarleton, also began to worry about what he privately called his subordinates' lack of military maturity. The Legion had won battles by charging into half-formed enemies. The Legion had never been tested against an enemy that had prepared specifically for them. The Legion was about to be tested. What is striking, reading the contemporary accounts, is how completely Tarleton failed to recognize the danger of his own reputation. The terror he inspired in the Southern population had not produced submission. It had produced an underground of partisan fighters whose hatred was personal. By January 1781, half the militiamen marching with Daniel Morgan had a brother, a cousin, a father, a neighbor killed by the British Legion. They were not afraid of him. They were waiting for him. Tarleton was riding toward a battle in which his greatest weapon, his reputation, had become his greatest liability. He did not know this. He had never thought of his reputation as a thing that could turn against him. He had only thought of it as a thing that won battles before they began. The orders from Cornwallis to Tarleton, issued on January 1st, 1781, were straightforward. Find Morgan. Destroy him. To accomplish this, Tarleton was given a formidable force. Approximately 1,100 effectives. The British Legion itself, both its mounted and infantry components. A detachment of the 17th Light Dragoons, professional British cavalry. The 1st Battalion of the 71st Highlanders, kilted Scottish veterans whose discipline was legendary. The 7th Royal Fusiliers, mostly young recruits but officered by experienced men. And 2 3-pounder cannons, light field pieces called grasshoppers because they leapt backward on their carriages when fired. It was a powerful, balanced force. Cavalry for shock and pursuit. Highlanders for discipline, Fusiliers for line work, artillery for the decisive moment. Tarleton had been given everything he could possibly need. What he did not have was time. The winter of 1781 had brought torrential rains to the Carolinas. The few roads that crossed the backcountry had turned into what one British officer described as ribbons of mud. Rivers were at flood stage. The epaulet, the Broad. Every stream was an obstacle. Every crossing was a delay. Tarleton's response to these conditions was characteristic. He drove his men harder. He marched them through cold rain. He cut their rest. He cut their food. In the 5 days preceding the battle, the British column was pushed to the breaking point. In the final 48 hours before contact, Tarleton's soldiers ran out of provisions entirely and received less than 4 hours of sleep. Read those numbers again. 1,100 men, no food for 48 hours, 4 hours of sleep across 2 nights, marched through freezing rain across flooded country. Tarleton believed exhaustion was a price his men could pay because the moment of contact would be brief. Hit Morgan, break Morgan, rest after the victory. Morgan, meanwhile, was conducting his retreat with the calm of a man who understood exactly what was being attempted against him. He fell back northward, accumulating militia reinforcements as he went. A large body of Carolina partisans under Colonel Andrew Pickens joined him. Local militia companies attached themselves to his column. By the time he reached the Broad River on the afternoon of January 16th, his force had swollen to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,900 men, depending on which contemporary count one accepts. The historian Lawrence Babbitts, after extensive analysis of muster rolls and pension applications, has argued for a figure on the higher end. Other historians have argued for lower estimates. The truth is that no one knows exactly how many men stood with Morgan that morning. The American Army of the Revolution did not maintain rolls with the precision of a European professional force. The Broad River was at flood stage, impassable without boats. To attempt a crossing with Tarleton's cavalry only hours behind would mean catching the army mid-river, half in boats, half on the bank. It would mean Camden again. It would mean the destruction of another American force. Morgan made his decision in the late afternoon of January 16th. He would not cross the Broad. He would turn. He would fight. And he would choose his ground. 6 miles south of the river, in the rolling pinelands of the South Carolina upcountry, lay a known landmark, a wide pasture used by local cattlemen to graze their herds before driving them to market. The undergrowth had been kept clear by years of cattle browsing. The trees were mature first-growth pines, widely spaced, allowing for clear lines of sight in every direction. The locals called it Hannah's Cowpens. To a conventional military officer, it was the worst possible ground for a defending force. Open, no cover for riflemen, excellent country for cavalry. A British officer looking at the field would see a parade ground. He would see exactly the kind of terrain on which professional infantry and dragoons could maximize their advantages. Daniel Morgan looked at the same ground and saw something different. He saw a trap waiting to be built. What Tarleton would see when he arrived at Cowpens on the morning of January 17th was a flat, open field. What Morgan saw when he walked it on the afternoon of January 16th was a series of small ridges and dips invisible to the untrained eye. The battlefield was approximately 500 yards long and about as wide. It looked flat. It was not. 2 low ridges crossed the field, running roughly perpendicular to the expected line of British advance. Between them lay a shallow swale, a gentle depression. Behind the second, higher ridge was a deeper gully, a fold in the ground sufficient to conceal mounted men from anyone standing on the field below. This is what Morgan saw. Not a parade ground, a theater. 3 stages, each at a slightly different elevation, each invisible from the others until you crested the ridge between them. An attacker advancing across this ground would not see his target until he was almost upon it, and what he saw would not be what was actually there. Then there was the river. Behind Morgan's chosen position, 6 miles to the north, lay the broad river, flooded, impassable. To any military theorist of the 18th century, putting your army's back against an impassable river was textbook suicide. It eliminated the option of retreat. It guaranteed that defeat would mean annihilation, because there was no way for the army to escape. Morgan understood this, and Morgan understood that his militia understood it too. He had watched militia at Camden. He had watched them at countless smaller engagements. He knew what happened when men with families and farms calculated the odds of standing against British regulars. They ran, not from cowardice, from arithmetic. The river behind them changed the arithmetic. If there was no retreat, the militia could not flee. If the militia could not flee, they had to fight. If they had to fight, then Morgan could plan a battle in which their fighting was not a hope, but a certainty. The flooded broad river was not a vulnerability. It was a wall that ensured the men in front of it would do exactly what they were told. This was the inversion that made Cowpens possible. Every other commander in American history facing the same situation would have seen the river as a trap. Morgan saw it as a tool. The same physical feature, looked at by 2 different minds, became either suicide or salvation. The difference was that Morgan understood his own men so completely that he could trust the river to do what generals had never been able to do reliably: make militia stand. Tarleton, reading the same situation through his own assumptions, came to the opposite conclusion. He looked at the river behind Morgan and saw a trapped enemy. He looked at the open field in front of Morgan and saw ground his cavalry could sweep. He looked at the militia in Morgan's lines and saw the same farmers who had broken at Camden. Everything Tarleton saw confirmed what Tarleton wanted to believe. Morgan was desperate. Morgan was cornered. Morgan would break at the first hard push. This was the moment the battle was lost, not on the field, in Tarleton's mind, before a single shot had been fired. What Daniel Morgan designed on the night of January 16, 1781, in the pine woods of Hannah's Cowpens, is the only piece of genuinely original tactical thought to emerge from the American Revolutionary War. Historians have argued about this. Some have suggested that Morgan was drawing on earlier examples: Frederick the Great's elastic defenses, the Roman concept of defense in depth. But the specific configuration Morgan deployed, the specific psychological understanding it embodied, was new. 18th century European warfare was built on the linear formation. A long line of infantry, 2 or 3 ranks deep, would deliver volleys at point-blank range until one line broke. Cavalry would protect the flanks. Artillery would soften the enemy before the main engagement. Battles were brutal, but their geometry was simple: mass against mass. Morgan looked at this convention and rejected it. He had perhaps 1,000 to 1,900 men, depending on which contemporary count one accepts. He divided them into 3 separate lines, each with a different composition, a different role, and crucially, a different psychological demand. The first line, deployed forward of all the others, consisted of approximately 120 to 150 selected sharpshooters, backwatermen, hunters, men who could hit a squirrel at 100 yards with a Pennsylvania long rifle. They were not deployed in formation. They were spread out behind trees, in loose order, well in front of the main body. And Morgan's instructions to them were surgical. Do not fire at the rank and file. Aim for the epaulets, aim for the officers, aim for the sergeants. Strip the British of their command structure before the real fighting began. Fire 2 or 3 shots, then fall back. The second line, positioned roughly 150 yards behind the sharpshooters, was the militia, 300 to 500 men under Colonel Andrew Pickens, farmers, partisans, the same kind of men who had run at Camden. And Morgan's instructions to them were the most important of his entire battle plan, because they were the instructions that made the whole system work. He did not lie to them. He did not pretend they were professional soldiers. He told them, in the simplest possible terms, exactly what they were and were not expected to do. "I do not expect you to stand against a British bayonet charge," he said. He only asked them to do one thing: fire 2 volleys at killing distance. Then, with their honor intact, withdraw around the American left flank and reform behind the third line. 2 volleys, not 5. Not until you broke. 2 specific shots, and then a planned retreat. The militia could accept this. The militia could deliver this. And what the militia did not know, because Morgan had not told them in these exact terms, was that their planned retreat would be the bait. Tarleton would see the militia falling back and read it the way he had read every previous American militia retreat, as collapse, as the moment to release the cavalry, as the beginning of the rout. The third line, another 150 yards back, on the crest of the second ridge, was the anvil. Approximately 550 seasoned Continentals from Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. These were professional soldiers, survivors of Camden, veterans of the brutal Southern campaign. They had muskets and bayonets. They were trained in the linear tactics of European warfare. Their role was simple: hold the ridge, receive the British charge, absorb the weight of what would be coming through the trees by the time it reached them. And behind the third line, concealed in the gully, hidden from the eyes of any British observer, waited the reserve. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, second cousin of the commander-in-chief, with 80 to 130 dragoons. American cavalry, the mobile strike force, invisible, patient, waiting for the moment when the British attack had committed itself, when the British flanks were exposed, when the trap was ready to spring. This was the design. 3 lines, each playing a different role, each understanding only its own part, together forming a single integrated mechanism whose purpose was to draw the British forward, then strip them of their leadership, then induce them to break formation, then receive them with disciplined fire, and finally to encircle them and annihilate them. Morgan walked among the campfires that night. He went to each unit. He spoke to the Georgia militia about the Carolinians. He spoke to the Carolinians about the Georgians. He proposed competitions of bravery between them. He told the Continentals that the militia had been given an honorable role they could fulfill. He told the militia that the Continentals were depending on them. He made each man feel that the man next to him was watching, and that running would be a betrayal of more than his own honor. Contemporary accounts from soldiers who survived the battle describe Morgan sitting on a stump near a campfire, his coat open despite the cold, pulling up his shirt to show the scars on his back. 500 lashes, he would say. The British still owe me one. By dawn, the trap was set. The old Wagoner had built his battlefield. And 6 miles to the south, Banastre Tarleton was rousing his exhausted, starving men for the final march into it. 2 o'clock in the morning on January 17th, 1781. Tarleton's column began moving in the dark. The men had slept for perhaps 2 hours. They had not eaten in nearly 2 days. The cold was severe enough that contemporary accounts describe ground that was frozen hard in places. The road was a track of mud and pine roots and standing water. But Tarleton drove them forward. He had received intelligence that Morgan was at Cowpens. He understood correctly that if Morgan crossed the broad river, Morgan would escape. He also understood incorrectly that an exhausted attack was better than a delayed attack. The mathematics of his career had always been speed. Speed had won him every fight. Speed would win this one. The advance guard of Tarleton's column began reaching the southern edge of the Cowpens battlefield as the eastern sky began to lighten. The morning, contemporary accounts agree, was clear and bitterly cold. Morgan had scouts out. He received word of the British approach before Tarleton's lead elements were within musket shot. The old Wagoner moved through the camp, rousing his men with a phrase that became famous. "Boys, get up. Benny is coming." The use of the familiar name was deliberate. Benny. Not Colonel Tarleton, not the Green Dragoon. Benny. A nickname. A man like any other. A man who could be beaten. Morgan was managing morale even in the way he announced the enemy's arrival. Tarleton, emerging from the wood line into the open pasture, did exactly what Morgan had predicted. He did not pause. He did not allow his men to rest. He did not eat. He did not reconnoiter. He looked at the field, looked at the visible American formation, looked at the militia in the second line that he could see, and ordered an immediate attack. His deployment was textbook. Artillery in the center, the 7th Royal Fusiliers and the British Legion Infantry forming the main line. The 71st Highlanders held in reserve on his left. 50 dragoons on each flank. The remainder of his cavalry held back for the pursuit that would inevitably come once the Americans broke. He had not noticed the gully behind the third line. He had not noticed the swale between the ridges. He had not detected the concealed dragoons. He had not, in fact, scouted the field at all. He had looked at it from a distance of perhaps 400 yards and decided he had seen what he needed to see. Tarleton's drums began to beat. His fifes shrilled the advance. The Legion infantry stepped forward with that strange British battlefield shout, the long halloo that was meant to terrify the militia. Morgan ordered his men to give it back. The Indian halloo, the frontiersman's war cry, the defiance of the backcountry. For a moment, the two sounds met in the cold air over the Cowpens pasture. The disciplined British shout, the wild American answer. And then the 1st British Dragoons spurred forward to sweep the American skirmishers from the field. The British Dragoons came on at a controlled trot, intending to clear the first line of American sharpshooters before the main infantry engagement. By the conventions of 18th century warfare, this was a routine task. Skirmishers were not expected to hold against cavalry. They were expected to fire once, perhaps twice, and then fall back to the safety of their main line. What Tarleton's dragoons encountered was something different. Morgan's sharpshooters were not standing in any kind of formation. They were spread across the southern half of the field in loose order, each man behind a tree, each man with a Pennsylvania long rifle. The Pennsylvania rifle was longer than a musket, slower to load, and could not mount a bayonet. In open battle against massed infantry, it was inferior to the standard British smoothbore. But the Pennsylvania rifle had one advantage that mattered enormously. It was accurate. A skilled rifleman could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards. The British musket, by contrast, would hit perhaps half the time at 50 yards and collapsed entirely beyond 100. A rifleman shooting at a musket-armed soldier had perhaps 4 times the effective range of the soldier shooting back. Morgan's instructions to his sharpshooters had been specific. Aim for the epaulets, aim for the officers, aim for the men giving orders. In the disciplined formations of 18th century British infantry, the loss of officers was not a minor inconvenience. It was structural collapse. British soldiers were trained to follow orders. When the men giving orders died, the soldiers continued to fight. But their fire became ragged, their movements became uncoordinated, their formation began to fray. The first volley from the American sharpshooters caught the British dragoons at a range they had not expected. Contemporary accounts speak of 15 dragoons going down in the opening minutes of the engagement. Whether the exact number was 15 or 12 or 20 is debated by historians. What is not debated is that the dragoons suffered casualties at a range, and to a degree that astonished them, and that a disproportionate number of those casualties were officers. The dragoons, surprised, pulled back. Tarleton, watching from the rear, did not yet understand what had happened. He saw his cavalry recoil, but he attributed this to the natural friction of a skirmish line. He ordered his main infantry line to advance. The 7th Royal Fusiliers, the British Legion Infantry, the artillery, all began to move forward across the field. Drums beating, fifes shrilling. The sharpshooters, having fulfilled their assigned task, fell back through the trees to join the militia line. What Tarleton had just witnessed, without recognizing it, was the first stage of Morgan's plan executing exactly as designed. The British had lost officers. The British formation had been pricked, deflected, irritated. The British dragoons on the flanks had received a small but unsettling lesson in the danger of charging directly into accurate rifle fire. And the sharpshooters, having done their work, had vanished into the American second line without a single American casualty worth recording. The first line had cost the British perhaps 15 to 20 men, including officers whose loss would be felt for the next 45 minutes of combat. It had cost the Americans nothing. From that moment forward, every British decision would be made by men who were slightly less informed, slightly less coordinated than they would have been if those officers had survived. Morgan had altered the speed at which the British Army could think. The British main line came forward in the manner that British main lines had always come forward. 2 ranks deep, bayonets fixed. The Fusiliers on the British right, the Legion infantry in the center, the Highlanders moving up on the British left. Behind them, the artillery, attempting to keep pace. The 7th Royal Fusiliers were on the British right. Their commander, Major Timothy Newmarsh, was an experienced officer, but his regiment was largely composed of recruits. They had been raised in 1773, brought to America in 1779, and many of them had not yet seen a major engagement. They moved forward with the discipline of British line infantry, but they moved with the inexperience of men who had not yet learned the rhythms of musket combat. Andrew Pickens, commanding the American second line, watched them come. His men had been told what to do. Hold fire until killing distance, 2 volleys, then withdraw. Pickens held his men through 100 yards, through 75 yards, through 50 yards. At what contemporary accounts describe as approximately 50 paces, the militia line opened fire. The Fusiliers, inexperienced, had fired first. They had loosed their volleys at ranges where their muskets were largely ineffective. They had wasted their first reload, their second reload, on a target that was holding its fire. When the militia volley came, it caught the Fusiliers at the moment when they were attempting to reload, when their hands were full of cartridges, when their attention was on the manual rather than on the enemy. The militia volley was devastating. The Fusiliers staggered. Officers went down. Sergeants went down. The Fusilier line, which had been pressing forward with the confidence of a unit expecting easy victory, suddenly slowed. Then the militia reloaded. Quickly. With the efficiency of men who had loaded their hunting rifles 1,000 times before. And they fired again. 2 volleys. just as Morgan had ordered. The second volley caught the British line in greater disorder than the first. The officers who had survived the opening fire were now exposed, their men's discipline beginning to fray, their formation no longer the clean, machine-like line that had stepped out of the wood line. Casualties in the British front rank had been heavy. And then, exactly as planned, exactly as ordered, exactly as predicted, Andrew Picken's militia began to withdraw. They did not break. They did not run. They fell back in a controlled retreat, moving toward the American left flank, swinging around the rear of the third line, heading for the rallying point Morgan had designated. They moved like men following orders, which is what they were. But to the British, watching from across the field, the retreat looked exactly the way American militia retreats had always looked at Camden, at Charleston, at every previous engagement of the Southern campaign. They saw farmers running. They saw a line dissolving. They saw the moment of collapse. Tarleton, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, made the decision he had been preparing to make since he first saw the American formation. He released his cavalry. The British Legion dragoons spurred forward at full gallop, sabers drawn, intent on running down the retreating militia. This was Tarleton's signature move. The moment when the enemy began to flee, the cavalry would convert retreat into rout into slaughter. The Legion had executed this maneuver a dozen times. It had never failed. The militia were running across open ground. They were exposed. Their long rifles, slow to reload, were no defense against mounted men with sabers. By every rational calculation, the British cavalry should have closed the distance in under a minute and turned the retreat into a massacre. What happened instead was that William Washington's American dragoons came out of the gully. They had been waiting there since before dawn. 80 to 130 mounted men, concealed by the fold in the ground, invisible to anyone observing the battlefield from the south. They were Continental dragoons, professional cavalry equipped with sabers and pistols. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, was a Virginia gentleman, a distant cousin of George Washington, and a veteran of the Northern campaigns. Washington's dragoons emerged from concealment at the moment the Legion cavalry had committed itself to the pursuit. They came in from the American left, striking the Legion's flank as it charged across the open ground in pursuit of the militia. The Legion dragoons, riding hard, focused entirely on the retreating farmers in front of them, did not see Washington coming until he was upon them. The cavalry melee that followed was brief and brutal. Contemporary accounts speak of 18 Legion dragoons killed in the initial clash. Sabers, pistol shots, the wild confusion of horses colliding at speed. The Legion, caught in the flank, lost its formation almost immediately. The dragoons who survived the initial impact wheeled their horses and fled back toward the British main line. The militia, who had been about to be cut to pieces, reached the rear of the American position safely. They began to reform under Picken's direction. Most of them would return to the battle within 20 minutes. What had just happened on the British right flank was the first stage of Morgan's double envelopment closing. It had not yet closed entirely. The Legion infantry was still advancing in the center. The Highlanders were still moving on the British left. The artillery was still in action. But the British cavalry on this side of the field, the cavalry Tarleton had counted on to convert the militia retreat into a rout, had been mauled. The flank was now open. Morgan saw it. He understood what it meant. The trap, which only minutes earlier had been a possibility, was now becoming a certainty. He rode forward along the third line, speaking to the Continentals. "The militia is reforming," he told them. "They will be back. Hold the ridge, hold the ridge." The man who said this could barely sit his horse for the pain. But the men he was speaking to could not see the pain. They could see only the calm. The British main line, having driven off the first two American lines, now came up against the third. The Continentals on the ridge, John Eager Howard's veterans of Camden, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia regulars, men who had stood in lines before, men who knew how to fight a European-style musket battle. The two lines closed to within 50 yards of each other and began to trade volleys. This was the kind of fighting that the British Army existed for. Two professional lines at close range, firing as fast as they could load until one side broke. It was the bloodiest form of combat in the 18th century. It was also the form of combat in which discipline, training, and the quality of officers mattered more than anything else. The Americans were outnumbered at this point in the battle. They were facing the bulk of the British infantry without the support of the militia, which was still reforming in the rear. But they were not outclassed. They were Continental Line. They had been trained by Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge. They knew how to load and fire in 3 ranks. They knew how to maintain a line. They knew, above all, how to die in place rather than run. The volleys exchanged on the ridge were murderous. Contemporary accounts describe smoke so thick that men could not see 10 yards in front of them. The British were taking heavy casualties. So were the Americans. But the ridge held. Tarleton, watching from behind his line, recognized that the frontal assault was stalling. The British infantry was no closer to breaking the American line than they had been 10 minutes earlier. Casualties were mounting. Officers were falling. The 7th Fusiliers, who had taken the brunt of the militia volleys and were now in a sustained firefight with the Continentals, were beginning to fray. Tarleton made his decision. He committed his reserve. The 71st Highlanders, the professional Scottish infantry he had been holding for exactly this moment. Major Arthur MacArthur's battalion, kilted, disciplined, with the reputation of one of the finest regiments in the British Army. Tarleton ordered the Highlanders to swing around the American right flank and roll up Howard's line. This was the most dangerous moment of the battle for the Americans. A flanking attack by fresh professional infantry would normally be decisive. If the Highlanders could turn the American right, the entire Continental line would have to either withdraw or be enveloped. Morgan's plan, which had worked perfectly so far, was about to face its most serious challenge. John Eager Howard, commanding the Continental line, saw the Highlanders coming. He understood what they were trying to do. And he gave the order that, in the noise and confusion of battle, would become the most famous misunderstanding in the history of American arms. He ordered Captain Andrew Wallace's company on the extreme right of the American line to refuse the right. This was a technical military term. It meant that the rightmost company should wheel backward and to the side, forming a new line perpendicular to the existing one, so that they could face the flanking Highlanders directly. Done correctly, it would create an L-shaped formation that would prevent the flank from being turned. But the command was given in the noise of battle. It was passed down the line by officers shouting over musket fire and the screaming of wounded men. And somewhere in that transmission, the command changed. The company did not wheel. It about-faced, and the rest of the Continental line, seeing the rightmost company turning to march to the rear, assumed they had been ordered to do the same. The entire Continental line began to retreat. For a moment, on the American side, it looked like Camden again. The third line, the Anvil, the professional Continental infantry on whom the entire battle plan depended, had turned its back on the enemy and was marching toward the rear. Howard, suddenly realizing what was happening, tried to halt them. He could not. The line was moving. The order had been given, misunderstood, and executed. The Continentals were withdrawing. Morgan, riding up to the line from his position behind the ridge, saw what was happening and felt, for a moment, the cold fear of total defeat. He rode hard to Howard. He demanded to know whether his men were beaten. Howard, calm in the way that only certain men are calm in the moment of crisis, looked at his retreating line and answered the question with a precise observation that would change the battle. The men, he said, were not beaten. They were moving in good order. Look at them. Look at their lines. Look at their step. They were retreating, but they were retreating like soldiers, not like routed troops. Morgan understood instantly. He spurred his horse to the rear, riding past the withdrawing Continentals, looking for a piece of ground where they could turn and make their stand. He found it on a slight rise, perhaps 80 yards back from the original position. He pointed. Here. Stand here. Face about. Fire. And the British, who had been watching the Continental line retreat, were doing exactly what Tarleton had hoped the Americans would do. They were breaking their own formation. They were running forward to catch the retreating enemy. They were converting their disciplined line into an excited, disorganized mass of men chasing what they believed was a beaten army. This was the moment. This was the 3 seconds that decided the battle. The British were charging. The Continentals were retreating. The space between them was closing fast. Howard's men, on Morgan's orders, reached the rise that had been designated as their rallying point. And at Howard's command, they stopped. They turned. They faced about. The British, charging in a disorganized mass, were within 30 paces of the American line. Some accounts say 20. Some say 15. Close enough, the contemporary phrase went, to see the whites of their eyes. And the Continentals, who had not been retreating in panic but in perfect order, raised their muskets and delivered a volley at point-blank range into a British formation that had completely lost its cohesion. The volley was devastating. Contemporary accounts describe dozens of British soldiers falling in a single instant. The front rank of the chasing formation simply collapsed. The men behind them ran into the bodies. The men behind those men, still pushing forward, ran into the men ahead. The disciplined British line, which only minutes earlier had been moving forward in textbook formation, was now a tangled, bloody, shocked mass of men who had not expected this. And before the British could recover, before the surviving officers could restore order, Howard ordered the bayonet charge. The Continentals, with their muskets still smoking, fixed bayonets and went forward. The American bayonet charge at Cowpens is one of the moments that historians have struggled to reconcile with the conventional narrative of the Revolutionary War. The standard story is that the Americans avoided bayonet combat. The standard story is that British regulars, with their training and their faith in cold steel, always won close quarters fighting against the less disciplined Continental troops. The standard story was wrong at Cowpens. The Continentals had been trained by Baron von Steuben. They had drilled with the bayonet through the winter at Valley Forge and every winter since. The men in the third line that morning were not the green recruits of 1776. They were 3-year veterans. They had survived Camden. They had survived the Southern Campaign. They knew exactly what to do with a bayonet at 30 paces. The British, in disorder, with their officers dead or wounded, with their formation broken by the volley they had just absorbed, could not absorb a charge. Hand-to-hand combat broke out across the front of the line. Maryland and Delaware men plunged their bayonets into Fusiliers and Legion infantry. Some British soldiers fought, others threw down their weapons. The line collapsed unit by unit. While this was happening on the British center, two other things were happening on the flanks. On the British right, where Washington's dragoons had earlier mauled the Legion cavalry, Washington now wheeled his force around and drove into the rear of the British infantry. 80 to 130 horsemen, sabers drawn, slamming into the back of a line that was already collapsing from the front. On the British left, where Pickens' militia had reformed in the rear after their controlled retreat, the militia had completed their long swing around the American position. They came back into the battle from the British left flank, fresh, reorganized, with reloaded rifles. They poured fire into the Highlanders and the Legion infantry on that side of the field. The double envelopment, which Morgan had designed before the first shot was fired, was now closing on the British from three sides at once. The Continental line in the front with bayonets, Washington's dragoons in the rear with sabers, Pickens' militia on the flank with rifle fire, and the British, exhausted, hungry, leaderless, were trapped. The 71st Highlanders, the last cohesive British unit on the field, attempted to hold. They were veteran soldiers. They were professionals. They had never run from a battle in their history. They formed a small defensive square and tried to fight their way out. Pickens' militia closed in from the left. Washington's dragoons came at them from the rear. The Continental line pressed forward in front. The Highlanders fought for perhaps 10 minutes. Their officers fell. Their formation contracted. And then, for the first time in the history of the regiment, the 71st Highlanders surrendered on the battlefield. The two British cannons, the grasshoppers that had been firing throughout the battle, were captured by American infantry. The Royal Artillery crews had stayed by their guns to the end. Contemporary accounts on both sides praised their valor. Some were killed standing beside their pieces. The survivors were captured. In less than an hour from the 1st British Dragoon spurring forward to clear the skirmishers, the British army that had marched onto Hannah's Cowpens at dawn had ceased to exist. Banastre Tarleton, watching from the rear of his collapsing army, made his last desperate decision. He had 200 to 300 Legion cavalry remaining. He ordered them to charge the American Continental line, to break through, to retrieve the situation by sheer shock action. It was the same maneuver that had won him every previous battle. Speed, aggression, the Legion cavalry striking at the moment of crisis. The Legion cavalry refused. Contemporary accounts describe what military historians call wild panic. The Legion troopers, watching their entire infantry support being destroyed in front of them, watching their fellow dragoons fleeing from earlier in the battle, watching Pickens's reformed militia closing in on the left, simply broke. They did not charge. They turned their horses and fled. Only a small group remained with Tarleton. Perhaps 40 to 50 men, mostly from the 17th Light Dragoons, the professional British cavalry detachment that had been attached to his force. With this remnant, Tarleton tried to cover the retreat of any surviving British troops who could escape from the trap closing in the field. William Washington, seeing Tarleton and a small group of British officers fleeing down the Green River Road, spurred his horse in pursuit. Washington was riding ahead of his own men, a habit that several historians have noted made him repeatedly vulnerable, but also repeatedly effective. He caught up to a small party of British officers a short distance down the road. What followed has become the most personal moment of the battle in American memory, though historians have raised questions about how dramatic the encounter actually was. The American account, preserved by John Eager Howard and others, describes a brief mounted melee. A British officer swung at Washington with a saber. Washington rose in his saddle to parry the blow, and the British officer's blade caught Washington's saber near the hilt, severing the American's weapon. Washington was now disarmed, holding only the hilt of his broken sword, in close combat with British officers. The British officer moved in to finish him. And then, a young soldier riding with Washington's dragoons, identified in later accounts as a man most likely named Collins, drew his pistol and shot the British officer in the shoulder. The officer fell from his horse. The identity and even the race of this man have been debated by historians. He appears in the surviving record only briefly. Howard's later recollection noted that the British officer who engaged Washington was believed to be Tarleton, but Tarleton's own account of the battle never mentions any personal duel with Washington. Tarleton describes his cavalry being driven back by Washington's dragoons, but writes nothing of being personally engaged or fired upon. Some historians believe the famous duel is a later embellishment of a more confused close encounter. In any event, Washington's dragoons galloped up to support their commander, and the British party broke off and fled. Washington pursued Tarleton's group for approximately 16 miles before giving up the chase near Thickety Creek. The personal duel between Washington and Tarleton, however it actually unfolded, became one of the most celebrated moments in the history of American arms. It was painted, written about, dramatized for a century afterward. Whether it happened exactly as American accounts describe it, or whether memory later sharpened a more chaotic encounter into something cleaner, the basic facts are not in dispute. Tarleton fled. The Legion died. In less than an hour, Tarleton's force of approximately 1,100 men had been functionally destroyed. The casualty figures are striking even by the standards of 18th century battles. The British lost approximately 110 killed. Of these, 39 were officers. This is one of the highest officer casualty rates of any major engagement in the Revolutionary War. Morgan's instruction to the sharpshooters to aim for the epaulets had been carried out, and it had been carried out at every stage of the battle, not just in the opening minutes. The British wounded numbered approximately 229. The British captured numbered between 600 and 829, depending on which contemporary count is accepted. Both cannons were taken. The entire baggage train was captured. Hundreds of muskets, thousands of rounds of ammunition, the supplies and equipment of an army. American casualties present a historical question. Morgan's official report listed 73 casualties total, but historian Lawrence Babbitts has argued this figure appears to have counted only the Continentals. North Carolina state records suggest 68 Continental and 80 militia casualties combined, and Babbitts has identified by name 128 American officers and soldiers killed or wounded at Cowpens. The traditional figures, cited in many sources, are 12 to 25 killed and 60 to 124 wounded. The Babbitts revision suggests the real American loss was closer to 150 total. No prisoners, no artillery lost. Whichever count one accepts, the disparity in casualties was historically extreme. Read those numbers one more time. The British suffered roughly 70 to 80% casualties. Even on the higher Babbitts estimates of American losses, the Americans suffered approximately 8%. Tarleton's army had been destroyed at a ratio that no one in the British command could have imagined possible. The 71st Highlanders had been forced to surrender. Their officers later petitioned Lord Cornwallis in writing to never be placed under Banastre Tarleton's command again. The petition survives in the British archives. It is a remarkable document. The most disciplined infantry regiment in the British Southern Army was formally requesting to be removed from the command of the officer who had led them to disaster. Tarleton himself reached Cornwallis's camp on the evening of January 17th or the morning of January 18th, depending on which account is followed. He brought the news that his force had been destroyed. He attempted to blame the disaster on his subordinates, on the conduct of the Legion cavalry, on the unsuitability of the terrain, on a dozen factors that did not include his own decisions. Cornwallis, to his credit, never publicly criticized Tarleton. Privately, the relationship between the two officers was never the same again. For Cornwallis, the strategic consequences of Cowpens were immediate and catastrophic. He had lost his light infantry. He had lost his cavalry's striking arm. He had lost the reconnaissance capability that had allowed his army to operate in the broken country of the southern interior. He could no longer move quickly. He could no longer screen his own movements. The eyes and ears of his army had been put out. Morgan, meanwhile, did what an experienced commander always does after a major victory. He did not pause to celebrate. He gathered his prisoners, his captured equipment, his wounded, and within hours of the battle, he was on the road north, marching to put distance between himself and any potential British pursuit. He understood that Cornwallis would come. He understood that the strategic situation required him to escape with his prize. Cornwallis did come, in a rage that contemporary witnesses described as almost biblical. He made the decision that would, more than any other single choice, lead to British defeat in the Southern Campaign. On approximately January 25th through 28th, 1781, at a place called Ramsor's Mill in North Carolina, Cornwallis ordered his army to burn its baggage. Tents, wagons, medical supplies, officers' personal belongings, rum stores, most of it. He intended to transform his entire army into a flying column, a force light enough and fast enough to catch Morgan and Greene and force a decisive engagement. The decision was understandable in tactical terms. It was catastrophic in operational terms. An army without tents is an army that sleeps in the rain. An army without medical supplies is an army whose wounded die. An army without wagons cannot carry food, cannot resupply ammunition, cannot maintain itself in the field for more than a few days at a time. What followed has been called the Race to the Dan. Cornwallis pursued Greene and Morgan across the Carolinas, through the rain and the cold of the winter of 1781, in a campaign that destroyed his army from the inside. Men deserted, men fell sick, men starved. By the time Cornwallis reached the Down River in mid-February, Greene had crossed it and escaped into Virginia. Cornwallis's army, which had begun the chase in fighting condition, was a shadow of itself. In March, Cornwallis turned south and met Greene at Guilford Courthouse. The battle that followed was technically a British victory. Cornwallis held the field. But the cost was so severe, so disproportionate to anything he could afford to lose, that one British member of Parliament observed afterward that another such victory would ruin the British Army. From Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis marched east to Wilmington, then north into Virginia. He was looking for a base. He was looking for resupply. He was looking for the decisive engagement that had eluded him all year. He found instead a small coastal town called Yorktown, where he established a defensive position in August of 1781 and waited for the Royal Navy to evacuate him. The Navy did not come in time. A French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake. A Franco-American army under Washington and Rochambeau marched south from New York. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army at Yorktown, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. The chain from Cowpens to Yorktown is direct. Cowpens destroyed Tarleton's light infantry. Cornwallis burned his baggage in pursuit of Morgan. The pursuit destroyed Cornwallis's army through attrition. The attrition forced Cornwallis to seek refuge on the Virginia coast. The refuge became a trap. The trap became a surrender. The surrender ended the war. There is no question that other factors contributed. French intervention, Washington's strategic patience, the unwillingness of the British political class to fund another year of fighting. But the immediate operational chain that led to Yorktown began with the destruction of Tarleton's force on a January morning in a South Carolina cow pasture. Daniel Morgan, who had begun that morning with 1,000 men and ended it with 12 to 25 killed, had not just won a battle. He had set the conditions for the strategic collapse of the British position in North America. Whether he understood, in the hours immediately after the battle, that this was what he had done is impossible to say. Most likely he did not. Most likely he was thinking only about the immediate problem of escaping with his prisoners before Cornwallis arrived. But the consequences of his tactical victory were strategic, and they were total. Military historians have studied the Battle of Cowpens for more than 2 centuries. The reason it is studied, beyond its strategic consequences, is the tactical innovation it embodied. The defense in depth that Morgan designed was not, as some popular accounts have suggested, an entirely new concept. The Romans had used defense in depth. Various European armies had experimented with multiple lines. Frederick the Great had employed elastic defenses in the 7 Years' War. What was new at Cowpens was not the concept of multiple lines, but the specific way Morgan integrated different types of troops into a single coherent battle plan, each playing to its strengths and accepting its limitations. The first line of sharpshooters was a missile force, designed to inflict precision casualties on enemy leadership before the main engagement. Its job was not to hold ground. Its job was to do specific damage and then withdraw. The second line of militia was a delaying force, designed to inflict casualties through volleys and then bait the enemy into a disorganized pursuit. Its job was not to win the battle. Its job was to draw the enemy into a position where the third line could win the battle. The third line of Continentals was the decisive force, designed to engage the British in a manner the British understood, on terms that favored the Continentals' training and discipline. Its job was to absorb the British attack and then deliver the counterstroke. The reserve of dragoons was the mobile force, designed to be committed at the moment of crisis to convert the battle from contested to decisive. Its job was to close the trap. Each element had a specific role. Each role supported the others. None of the elements was asked to do more than it was capable of doing. The militia were not asked to hold against bayonets. The Continentals were not asked to scout in open order. The dragoons were not asked to charge prepared positions. The sharpshooters were not asked to stand against cavalry. Every unit was used in the manner that maximized its strengths and minimized its weaknesses. This is what military theorists call combined arms doctrine, the integration of different troop types into a single mutually supporting system. It is the dominant doctrine of modern warfare. It was, in 1781, exceptionally rare. Most 18th century commanders treated their units as interchangeable line infantry. Morgan treated his units as specialized tools, each chosen for the specific task he assigned to it. The other innovation, the one that historians have written about most, was Morgan's understanding of psychology. Tarleton was not defeated because the Americans were stronger. Tarleton was defeated because Morgan had predicted, almost perfectly, what Tarleton would do in every situation he was likely to encounter. Tarleton would charge the skirmishers. Tarleton would pursue the militia. Tarleton would commit the Highlanders to the flank. Tarleton would order the cavalry charge. Each of these decisions was predictable. Each was anticipated. Each was prepared for. This is the deepest lesson of Cowpens. The battle was not won by tactical formation alone. It was won by the calculation of the enemy's mind. Morgan understood Tarleton better than Tarleton understood himself. He had built a trap whose every door was the door Tarleton was expected to walk through. And Tarleton, on the morning of January 17th, walked through every one of them. A modern military aphorism, often attributed to various sources, holds that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. Cowpens suggests an addition to that aphorism. Masters talk psychology. Morgan was a master. The men who fought at Cowpens scattered, as the men of every battle scatter, into the rest of their lives. Daniel Morgan, the architect of the victory, retired from active service within months of the battle. His sciatica had become unmanageable. He could not continue to campaign. He returned to his farm in Virginia, where he lived for another 21 years. He was elected to Congress in 1797. He was a Federalist. He died in 1802 at approximately 65 years of age and was buried in Winchester, Virginia. His military reputation, which had been mixed during his lifetime, grew steadily after his death. By the late 19th century, he was recognized as one of the most original tactical minds in American history. John Eager Howard, who had commanded the Continental Line and ordered the charge that broke the British, survived the war and returned to Maryland. He served as governor of Maryland from 1788 to 1791, was offered the position of Secretary of War by George Washington in 1795, an offer he declined, and served as a United States Senator from 1796 to 1803. He died in 1827. Andrew Pickens, the commander of the second line of militia, returned to South Carolina and continued the partisan war against the British until the end of the conflict. He later served in Congress as a representative from South Carolina. He died in 1817. He was, by the testimony of every contemporary who knew him, one of the most reliable militia officers in the entire war. William Washington, the dragoon commander whose horse charge had broken the Legion cavalry, was wounded and captured at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in September 1781. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. After his release, he returned to South Carolina, married a wealthy heiress, and lived as a planter until his death in 1810. Banastre Tarleton's fate is more complicated. He returned to England with Cornwallis after Yorktown, where he was initially regarded as a hero. He wrote his own history of the Southern Campaign in 1787, a work that defended his conduct at Cowpens and attempted to shift blame for the disaster onto his subordinates and onto Cornwallis. The book was severely criticized by Lieutenant Roderick Mackenzie of the 71st Highlanders, who had been wounded at Cowpens, and published a detailed rebuttal. Tarleton entered Parliament in 1790 as a member representing Liverpool and served there for over 20 years. He continued to receive promotion in the army, eventually rising to the rank of general, though he never again held an active field command. He was made a baronet in 1815 and died in 1833 at the age of 78. He never returned to America. The 71st Highlanders, who had been forced to surrender at Cowpens, were eventually exchanged or paroled. The regiment was disbanded at the end of the war in 1783, as was typical for wartime raised regiments. The regimental records preserve the names of the officers and men who surrendered that morning. The young soldier who saved William Washington's life on the Green River Road appears in only a handful of brief contemporary mentions. He has often been depicted as African American in later artistic representations, most famously by William Ranney in his 1845 painting of the moment. Whether Ranney's depiction reflected an actual tradition or his own assumption about who would have served in this role has been debated by historians. The man whose pistol shot may have changed the outcome of the most famous personal encounter of the Revolutionary War vanished into the silence that swallowed almost all of the lesser-ranked soldiers of the war. Estimates of African American soldiers serving on the Patriot side range from 5,000 to as many as 20,000. They were at every major battle. They are almost entirely absent from the main narrative. Cowpens stands as a reminder of this absence. For 2 centuries, Cowpens has held a particular place in American military memory. It is taught at West Point. It appears in every history of the Revolutionary War. It is studied by military officers around the world as an example of tactical innovation. The reasons it is remembered are different from the reasons most battles are remembered. Cowpens is not remembered because it was decisive in itself. Yorktown was more decisive. Saratoga was more decisive. It is not remembered because it was the largest battle of the war. It was a relatively small engagement, perhaps 3,000 men total on both sides. It is not remembered because it produced a famous quote or a famous personality. Though the personal duel between Washington and Tarleton has become a piece of American folklore, Cowpens is remembered because of what it teaches. It teaches that a smaller force can defeat a larger force if it can choose the ground, choose the time, and choose the rules of engagement. Morgan did all 3. It teaches that militia, properly understood and properly employed, can defeat regulars. This was not the conventional wisdom of the 18th century. The British believed militia were worthless against professional troops. Most American commanders believed it too. Morgan proved both groups wrong. It teaches that psychology is the deepest variable in warfare. Tarleton was not defeated by superior numbers or superior equipment. He was defeated by a commander who understood him better than he understood himself. It teaches that flexibility, not rigidity, is the mark of tactical mastery. Morgan's plan worked, but it also worked when an order was misunderstood. The retreat that should have been a controlled wheel became an apparent rout, and the apparent rout became the trap that broke the British line. Morgan's plan was robust enough that even its mistakes contributed to its success. It teaches that combined arms matter. Sharpshooters alone could not have won Cowpens. Militia alone could not have won Cowpens. Continentals alone could not have won Cowpens. Each force was insufficient by itself. Together, they were unstoppable. And it teaches that the British Southern strategy, which had appeared so promising in 1779 and 1780, was fundamentally flawed. The British had counted on Loyalist support. They had not understood that their own tactics, in officers like Tarleton, were creating patriots faster than they could win battles. They had not understood that the backcountry of the southern states was not a passive territory waiting to be controlled, but an active population with its own grievances and its own capacity for organized resistance. They had not understood, ultimately, the country they were fighting in. The man who taught them this lesson, the wagon driver from the Virginia frontier with a back full of scars and a body breaking down from years of campaigning, did not write a treatise on war. He did not establish a school of tactics. He did not, so far as we know, ever attempt to articulate the principles he had embodied at Cowpens. He simply did what he did, and his battle survived him in the records and the analyses and the textbooks, to teach what he had not bothered to put into words. The Cowpens battlefield today is a national battlefield park administered by the National Park Service. It lies in northern South Carolina, about 20 miles south of the North Carolina border. The park preserves approximately 840 acres, which includes most of the original battlefield. A visitor walking the field today can still trace the basic features that Morgan exploited. The ridges, lower than they once were after 2 centuries of plowing and erosion, are still visible. The swale between the first and second American lines is still there. The deeper gully where William Washington's dragoons waited can still be located. The trees have grown back. The first-growth pines that Morgan's army saw on the morning of January 17th are long gone. The forest today is younger, denser, with more undergrowth than the cattle-grazed parkland of 1781. But the contours of the ground are the same. The geometry that Morgan saw is still readable in the land. There is a monument at the center of the field, erected in the late 19th century. There are markers for the various American positions. The site receives a steady flow of Americans who come to walk the ground where the Southern campaign turned. The bodies of the dead are not at Cowpens. The British dead were buried in unmarked graves near where they fell, then later disturbed and reburied during the agricultural era of the 19th century. The American dead were taken north by Morgan's retreating column. What preserves them is the field itself, the ridges, the swale, the gully, the places where men in green coats and red coats and hunting shirts stood, fired, fell, and either died or survived. The ground retains the shape that made the battle possible. And as long as it does, the memory of what happened there is, in some quiet sense, preserved. The battle ended in less than an hour. The consequences did not. If a modern military officer were to study Cowpens for the lessons it offers, the lessons would not be the specific tactical formations Morgan employed. 18th century smoothbore muskets and Pennsylvania long rifles are obsolete. Cavalry sabers are obsolete. 3-pounder grasshopper cannons are obsolete. The specific maneuvers that Howard and Pickens and Washington executed are not directly applicable to any modern battlefield. What is applicable is the underlying logic. The first principle is the importance of knowing the enemy. Morgan did not just know what Tarleton would do. He knew what Tarleton believed about Americans, about militia, about the dynamics of pursuit and route. He had constructed his entire battle plan around his understanding of his opponent's mind. Modern intelligence services and modern military planners spend enormous resources attempting to do what Morgan did with no resources at all. He simply paid attention to the man across from him. The second principle is the importance of knowing your own forces. Morgan did not pretend his militia were what they were not. He did not order them to do things he knew they would not do. He calibrated every assignment to the actual capability of the unit receiving the order. This sounds simple. It is one of the hardest things in command. The temptation to demand more than a unit can deliver, to ask for the heroic effort that exceeds the unit's actual capacity, is constant. Morgan resisted it. He asked his militia for exactly 2 volleys and a controlled retreat. He got exactly 2 volleys and a controlled retreat. The third principle is the importance of designing for failure. Morgan's plan included a deliberate retreat, an intentional movement that looked like collapse. This required him to be willing to accept the appearance of defeat in order to achieve the reality of victory. Most commanders, faced with the choice between a maneuver that looks like winning and a maneuver that produces winning, will choose the former. Morgan chose the latter. His confidence in the underlying mechanism of his plan was such that he was willing to let his subordinate commanders fall back, willing to let it look like the army was breaking, willing to absorb the psychological shock of apparent defeat in order to set up the actual victory. The fourth principle is the importance of reserves. The most striking thing about Morgan's plan, looked at in retrospect, is how much of his force he held back. The Continentals on the ridge, Washington's dragoons in the gully, Pickens's militia who would withdraw and reform. None of these forces was committed until the moment when their commitment would be decisive. Morgan was patient. He let the British come. He let them advance through the first line. He let them advance through the second line. He did not commit his decisive forces until the British had stretched themselves so far forward that they could not recover. The fifth principle is the importance of geography. Morgan did not fight at Cowpens because Cowpens was the best location for an American army. He fought at Cowpens because Cowpens was a location whose specific topography supported the specific plan he wanted to execute. The ridges, the swale, the gully, even the flooded river behind his position, were all components of the battle plan. They were not the setting in which the battle took place. They were the weapons with which the battle was won. These principles do not require muskets to remain valid. They have appeared in different forms in every successful defensive battle ever fought by an outnumbered force. The defense of Stalingrad in 1942 followed similar logic on an immensely larger scale. The Israeli defense of the Golan Heights in 1973 did so with armored vehicles and anti-tank missiles instead of muskets and bayonets. The lesson is not in the equipment. The lesson is in the mind that arranges the equipment. Morgan's mind, on the morning of January 17, 1781, was the kind of mind that arranges weapons into systems. Most commanders, then and now, arrange weapons into lines. The difference between a line and a system is the difference between losing and winning when you are outnumbered. The battle ended just after 10 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour from the 1st Dragoon Spur to the surrender of the last Highland Company. By noon, Morgan was already moving his army north, away from the field, carrying his prisoners and his captured supplies, racing to put distance between himself and the British retaliation he correctly assumed was coming. The field, when he left it, was a scene that contemporary accounts describe in the spare language of men who had seen too much to make it dramatic. The bodies of the British dead scattered across 500 yards of pasture. The 2 captured cannons still smoking. The wounded, both British and American, being tended by surgeons who had set up a temporary hospital at the rear of the field. Morgan himself, having directed the gathering of the prisoners and the equipment, mounted his horse with the help of his aides and rode north. He was in pain. His sciatica was severe. He would resign from active service within a few months. But on that morning, on the road leading away from Hannah's Cowpens, he was the most successful tactical commander in the history of the American Army. He had taken on a force superior in numbers, superior in equipment, superior in professional training, and he had destroyed it almost completely, with casualties that were trivial in proportion. There is a moment in every great battle when the outcome becomes inevitable. At Cowpens, that moment was not the bayonet charge, though the bayonet charge was the visible climax. It was not the volley at 30 paces, though the volley was the technical pivot. It was earlier. It was the moment when Morgan, walking the field on the afternoon of January 16th, looked at the ridges and the swale and the gully, looked at the flooded broad river 6 miles to the north, looked at the open pasture that the British would see as a parade ground, and decided to fight there. That decision was the battle. Everything that came after, the nighttime visits to the campfires, the deployment of the 3 lines, the orders given and received, the volleys fired and the bayonets fixed, the charges and countercharges, the personal duel on the Green River Road. All of it was the playing out of a decision that had been made the day before. A decision based on a reading of terrain that Tarleton would not perform, on a reading of the enemy's mind that Tarleton would not attempt, on a reading of his own men that Tarleton was incapable of understanding. For a moment, in a frozen pasture in the South Carolina backcountry, the impossible stood. A wagon driver with 500 lashes on his back commanded an outnumbered force of farmers and Continentals and partisans against the most feared cavalry officer in the British Army. The wagon driver won. The British Legion died. The consequences of that morning would ripple outward for the next 9 months. Cornwallis would burn his baggage. The race to the Dan would destroy his army. Guilford Courthouse would be a victory he could not afford. Yorktown would be the trap from which he could not escape. American independence would become not a hope, but an arithmetic certainty. Daniel Morgan did not know any of this on the morning of January 17, 1781. He knew only that the British were coming. He knew only that his men were ready. He knew only that the trap he had built was about to be tested. Some traps work, some do not. This one worked. The British charge that came down the Green River Road that morning was the most professional, the most aggressive, the most confident attack the British Army had launched in the Southern campaign. It met the most carefully designed defense any American commander had ever constructed. The collision lasted less than 60 minutes. When it ended, the question of whether the American Revolution would succeed had been answered, though no one on the field that morning yet realized it. 800 British soldiers dead, wounded, or captured. 12 American dead. 2 captured cannons. A British army destroyed. A Southern campaign broken. The mathematics said the British would win. The mathematics said an army of 1,100 professional regulars would crush a force of farmers and partisans. The mathematics said Banastre Tarleton, with his legion at his back and the 71st Highlanders in support, would do at Cowpens what he had done at the Waxhaws and at Camden. The mathematics was wrong. Sometimes the impossible is just mathematics, waiting for someone clever enough to rewrite the equation. Sometimes the smaller force wins. Sometimes preparation defeats numbers. Sometimes the side that is hungrier, tireder, more outnumbered, more poorly equipped, can still find a way to break the side that is supposed to win if the side that is supposed to win brings nothing but its assumptions to the field. In a narrow valley in the Carolina backcountry, on a January morning, a wagon driver named Daniel Morgan proved that mathematics doesn't always decide, that sometimes geometry does, that sometimes the man who reads the ground, reads the enemy, reads his own men with the patient care of someone who has spent his life understanding what people are capable of doing, can turn impossible into inevitable. The trenches of Dara waited for arrogant generals to charge into them. The pasture of Hannah's Cowpens waited for the same purpose. Different centuries, different empires, different weapons. Same lesson. When you cannot match your enemy's numbers, change the battlefield until numbers don't matter. Daniel Morgan changed the battlefield. The British Legion died, and the road to Yorktown ran straight through a cow pasture in South Carolina, where for less than an hour on a bitterly cold January morning, mathematics bent backward and the impossible became real. The battle ended. The consequences did not. Sometimes mathematics doesn't matter. Sometimes genius does.